$800 million sat frozen in offshore accounts, waiting for a single gavel strike to vanish forever. Inside the Daniel Patrick Moynihan courthouse, New York's most feared syndicate boss straightened his tailored suit, expecting his legendary defense attorney to walk through the mahogany doors. Instead, a 24-year-old intern clutching a ruptured briefcase stumbled in. She had no license, no backup, and 30 seconds to prevent an empire's collapse. This is how empires fall, and how unexpected queens rise. Rain lashed against the heavy glass doors of the Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Foley Square was a mess of black umbrellas, shouting reporters, and the flashing red and blue lights of NYPD cruisers. Inside the grand lobby, 24-year-old Vivian Clark stood dripping wet, clutching a battered leather messenger bag to her chest as if it were a life preserver. Vivian was a third-year law student at Columbia University and an overworked, severely underpaid intern at Hanover, Crane, and Miller, one of Wall Street's most ruthless criminal defense firms. For the past 6 months, she had lived on black coffee, stale bagels, and 3 hours of sleep a night, single-handedly drafting every motion, brief, and evidentiary exhibit for the most high-stakes forfeiture case in the firm's history. The client was Antonio Roth. Publicly, Roth was a venture capitalist, a charming philanthropist who donated millions to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and sat on the boards of 3 major Manhattan charities. Privately, he was the undisputed head of the Roth Syndicate, a modern, highly sophisticated organized crime family that controlled shipping ports from Newark to Miami. The Department of Justice had spent 5 years trying to nail him for racketeering. They had failed. Now, they were trying a different tactic: civil asset forfeiture. The federal government, led by a highly ambitious assistant United States attorney, had frozen $800 million of Roth's assets across various international accounts, claiming they were the proceeds of money laundering. Today was the final forfeiture hearing. If they lost, the DOJ would seize the money, paralyzing Roth's legitimate and illegitimate businesses alike. It would be a fatal wound to his empire. Vivian checked her phone for the 50th time. Call forwarded to voicemail. Raina Hanover, the senior partner and Roth's lead counsel, was completely unreachable. Hanover was a legal titan, a man who charged $2,000 an hour to keep the city's worst criminals in custom-made Italian suits instead of orange jumpsuits. But he was also a functioning alcoholic with a penchant for high-stakes gambling in Atlantic City. "Where are you, Raina?" Vivian whispered, her voice trembling as she dialed his number again. Nothing. She walked toward the security checkpoint, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was supposed to meet Raina here 30 minutes ago, to hand him the final cross-examination binders. She had color-coded everything. She had spent the entire weekend mapping out the complex web of shell companies, routing numbers and swift transfers, finding the tiny discrepancies that Raina would use to dismantle the government's forensic accountant on the stand. As Vivian cleared the metal detectors and stepped into the marble-floored elevator bank, a cold, oppressive silence seemed to fall over the corridor. The elevator doors chimed open. Stepping out was Antonio Roth. He was surrounded by a phalanx of large men in dark suits, but even without them, he commanded the space entirely. Standing 6'3", Roth was devastatingly handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features, dark hair swept back with careless precision, and eyes the color of a winter ocean. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit that whispered of European tailoring, a crisp white shirt, and a subtle Patek Philippe watch that caught the harsh fluorescent light of the courthouse. He moved with the predatory grace of a panther, silent, lethal, and entirely unbothered by the federal weight bearing down on his shoulders. Vivian froze. She had only seen him from a distance in the firm's conference rooms, usually while she was fetching coffee or carrying boxes of documents. She had never actually spoken to him. Roth's piercing gaze swept the corridor, his jaw tightening slightly when he registered the absence of his lead attorney. His eyes eventually landed on Vivian. He recognized her. Not her name, perhaps, but he recognized the exhausted, terrified law clerk who trailed behind Hanover like a ghost. He detached himself from his bodyguards and walked slowly toward her. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Where is Rayner?" Roth asked. His voice was a low, smooth baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down Vivian's spine. It wasn't a question, it was a demand. Vivian swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. "Mr. Roth, I don't know. He isn't answering his phone. I've tried calling his residence, his driver, and his private cell. He's missing." Roth didn't flinch, but his eyes darkened, turning from a cool grey to a tempestuous storm. "Missing?" he repeated softly. The word sounded dangerous on his tongue. "My trial begins in 12 minutes. $800 million of my capital is on the line. And you are telling me my lawyer is missing. I am so sorry, sir," Vivian stammered, hugging the heavy binders closer to her chest. "I have all the files. Everything is prepared. The moment he gets here." "He isn't coming," Roth cut her off, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, but laced with a lethal certainty. "The DOJ has been squeezing Hanover's offshore gambling debts for months. I assumed he had the spine to hold out. It appears I was wrong. He's cut a deal, or he's on a flight to Geneva." Vivian's breath hitched. Rayner Hanover had sold out his biggest client. The implications were staggering. "What do we do?" she whispered, the professional boundary slipping away in her panic. Roth looked down at her, really looked at her. He took in her damp, slightly frizzy brown hair, the cheap navy blazer from H&M, the ink stains on her fingers, and the sheer volume of paperwork she was effortlessly balancing in her arms. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Vivian. Vivian Clark." "Well, Vivian Clark," Roth said, adjusting his French cuffs. "It appears you're going to walk into courtroom 14B and buy me some time." "Me?" Vivian choked out, her eyes widening in sheer terror. "I can't. I haven't passed the bar. I'm just an intern. I'm not legally allowed to represent you in a federal proceeding." "You aren't representing me. You are going to go in there, inform the judge that lead counsel has suffered a medical emergency, and request a 48-hour continuance so my associates can secure new representation," Roth instructed, his tone brooking absolutely no argument. "Can you do that?" Vivian looked into those cold, commanding eyes. She nodded slowly. Yes. I can ask for a continuance." "Good," Roth murmured, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. "Don't let them see you bleed, Vivian." Courtroom 14. B was an intimidating arena of dark oak, high-vaulted ceilings and rigid federal authority. Presiding over the case was the Honorable Arthur Jenkins, a notoriously short-tempered judge with a reputation for mercilessly shutting down unprepared attorneys. On the right side of the aisle sat the government's legal team, a polished army of federal prosecutors led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Philip Davies. Davies was leaning back in his chair, smiling smugly, entirely aware that Rayner Hanover was nowhere to be found. Davies had planned this. On the left side sat Antonio Roth, exuding an aura of terrifying calm, his hands resting lightly on the defense table, and next to him sat Vivian Clark. She felt like an absolute imposter. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to hide them under the table. The heavy legal binders were stacked neatly in front of her, a fortress of paper that offered little comfort against the glaring eyes of the courtroom. "All rise," the bailiff barked. Judge Jenkins swept into the room, his black robes billowing. He slammed his gavel down and took his seat, glaring at the defense table. "Be seated! We are here on the matter of the United States versus Roth Holdings, regarding the government's motion for civil asset forfeiture," Jenkins announced, adjusting his reading glasses. He looked over the rim of the lenses. "I see a heavily populated prosecution table, and I see the defendant. I do not, however, see Mr. Rayner Hanover. The court was informed we would begin promptly at 9 o'clock. Davies stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, the government is present and ready to proceed. If opposing counsel has failed to appear, we respectfully request that a default judgment be entered in favor of the United States, granting the immediate seizure of the contested $800 million. Vivian's heart stopped. Default judgment? No trial, just an immediate, devastating loss. She looked at Roth. He wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at her. His expression was impassive, but his eyes held a silent, intense pressure. "Do it." Vivian scrambled to her feet. Her chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor, echoing in the silent room. "Your Honor," Vivian stammered, her voice cracking on the first syllable. She cleared her throat, digging her fingernails into her palms to ground herself. "Your Honor, my name is Vivian Clark. I am a legal intern at Hanover, Crane and Miller. I am here to inform the court that Mr. Hanover has suffered a sudden and severe medical emergency." Judge Jenkins frowned, his bushy white eyebrows drawing together. "Medical emergency? Has he been hospitalized?" "We are awaiting confirmation, Your Honor," Vivian lied smoothly, the instinct for survival kicking in. Given the circumstances, the defense respectfully requests a 48-hour continuance so that substitute lead counsel can be appointed and briefed. Davies scoffed loudly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a classic delay tactic. Mr. Hanover's firm has over 60 partners. If he were truly incapacitated, another partner would have been dispatched. Instead, they sent a law student. The government's witnesses are here. The expert forensic accountant has flown in from London. We demand to proceed, or we demand a default judgment." Judge Jenkins looked at Vivian, his gaze piercing. "Mr. Davies makes a valid point, Miss Clark. Where is the rest of your firm?" Vivian's mind raced. If she admitted the firm had abandoned them, Jenkins would rule for the government. The money would be gone. Roth would be destroyed. "Your Honor," Vivian said, her voice growing slightly stronger, the terror beginning to crystallize into sharp, desperate focus. "Mr. Hanover is the sole partner intimately familiar with the 200,000 pages of financial discovery in this case. Sending another partner who has never read the file would be a violation of Mr. Roth's Sixth Amendment, right to effective assistance of counsel, even in a civil forfeiture proceeding. I am intimately familiar with the file. I prepared it. I am asking for 48 hours. "Denied," Jenkins snapped, banging his gavel. Vivian flinched. "This court will not be played, Miss Clark," Jenkins continued angrily. "The defense has had 2 years to prepare for this hearing. You have a choice. You can either proceed right now, using whatever notes Mr. Hanover left you, or I will rule in favor of the government's motion for default judgment." A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Davies grinned, leaning over to whisper something to his co-counsel. Vivian sank slowly into her chair. Her vision blurred. It was over. She couldn't litigate a federal forfeiture case. She wasn't even a lawyer. Beside her, Antonio Roth leaned in. The scent of bergamot, cedar, and raw danger washed over her. His shoulder brushed against hers, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "What happens now?" he asked softly, so only she could hear. "He's forcing us to proceed," Vivian whispered back, fighting the tears welling in her eyes. If we don't, you lose the 800 million immediately. If we do, I have to act as your counsel, under student practice rules. But I can't. I've never questioned a witness in my life. Roth turned his head, his face inches from hers. The sheer proximity of him was suffocating, intoxicating. He looked at the massive stacks of binders in front of her. "Who wrote those?" he asked. "I did," she whispered. "Who found the errors in the prosecution's financial timeline?" "I did." "Who knows where every single cent of that 800 million came from?" Vivian swallowed. "I do." Roth reached out, his large, warm hand covering hers where it rested on the table. His grip was firm, grounding, entirely possessive. "Raina Hanover was a figurehead," Roth said, his voice a dark velvet command. "He was a suit I paid for the optics. You are the brains of this operation, Vivian. You know my money better than I do. Stand up. Protect what is mine." Vivian stared into his eyes. There was no fear in him, only an absolute, unwavering belief in her. It was a terrifying, exhilarating realization. This Mafia kingpin, a man who commanded legions of dangerous men, was placing his entire empire in her trembling hands, and she realized, with a sudden, violent clarity, that she would rather die than let him down. Vivian slipped her hand out from under his. She stood up, her spine ramrod straight, her chin lifted high. The trembling had stopped. "Your Honor," Vivian Clark said, her voice ringing out clear and authoritative, silencing the murmurs in the courtroom. "Pursuant to the Southern District of New York's student practice rule, I am formally requesting the court's permission to represent Mr. Roth in today's proceedings. The defense is ready to begin." The courtroom felt like it was holding its collective breath. Judge Jenkins stared down at Vivian, searching for any sign of a bluff. Finding none, he gave a curt nod. "Very well, Miss Clark. You are temporarily admitted under the student practice rule." "May God help your client," Jenkins said dryly. "Mr. Davies, call your first witness." A USA Davies strutted to the podium, looking like a man who had already won. The government calls Special Agent Thomas Kessler. A tall, austere man in a cheap grey suit walked through the wooden gates and took the stand. Agent Kessler was a veteran forensic accountant for the FBI. He had built his entire career taking down financial syndicates. For the next 45 minutes, Davies led Kessler through a highly technical, devastatingly thorough, direct examination. Kessler detailed a labyrinthine network of shell companies based in the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and the Isle of Man. He traced a series of wire transfers totaling exactly $800 million, flowing from a supposedly legitimate shipping front into a private Swiss vault controlled by Roth Holdings. Kessler painted a flawless picture of international money laundering. He made Antonio Roth look like the most sophisticated criminal mastermind since Al Capone. Through it all, Vivian furiously took notes. She didn't look at the prosecution. She didn't look at the judge. She looked only at her own meticulous spreadsheets, cross-referencing Kessler's testimony against the thousands of pages of swift transfer logs she had memorized over the past 6 months. "Agent Kessler," Davies said, wrapping up his direct. "In your expert opinion, based on your review of the Deutsche Bank financial logs, were these funds generated by legitimate business operations?" "No, sir," Kessler replied confidently. "They exhibit all the classic hallmarks of a layered money laundering operation designed to conceal illicit maritime smuggling revenues." "Thank you. No further questions." Davies smiled, returning to his seat. He shot Vivian a patronizing look. "Your turn, little girl." Judge Jenkins looked down at the defense table. Miss Clark, cross-examination. Vivian stood. She didn't walk to the podium. Instead, she picked up a heavy, red-tabbed binder and stepped directly into the center of the courtroom, standing just a few feet away from the witness box. "Good morning, Agent Kessler," Vivian began, her voice perfectly steady. "Good morning," Kessler replied dismissively. "Agent Kessler, your entire testimony regarding the illegal origin of this $800 million relies heavily on a series of transfers routed through a Deutsche Bank branch in Frankfurt, correct?" "Yes, that is correct. Specifically, you claim that between March 12th and April 15th of 2021, Mr. Roth directed the transfer of these funds from a Cypriot shell company into the primary Roth Holdings account." "Yes," Kessler said, narrowing his eyes slightly. "The digital footprint is undeniable." Vivian opened her binder. "Your Honor, permission to approach the witness with Defense Exhibit 402-B. "Granted," Jenkins said, watching her closely. Vivian handed the document to Kessler. "Agent Kessler, could you identify this document for the court?" Kessler adjusted his glasses, looking at the paper. "It appears to be the official corporate registry filings for the Cypriot company in question, verified by the International Chamber of Commerce." "Thank you," Vivian said, pacing slowly back toward the defense table. "Can you read the date on which that Cypriot company was legally incorporated?" Kessler hesitated. He looked at the document again. A small frown creased his forehead. "It says, August 22nd, 2021. The courtroom fell dead silent. Vivian stopped pacing. She turned on her heel and locked eyes with the federal agent. "August 22nd, 2021, Vivian repeated loudly, ensuring every person in the gallery heard it. "Agent Kessler, you just testified under oath that my client transferred funds out of this company between March and April of 2021. But according to the internationally verified corporate registry you are holding in your hand, this company didn't even exist until August of that year. Is that correct?" A USA Davies jumped to his feet. "Objection. Your Honor, counsel is badgering the witness over a clerical error." "A clerical error regarding the foundational timeline of the government's entire case?" Vivian shot back instantly, her voice slicing through the air like a whip. "Your Honor, the government is attempting to seize $800 million based on a digital footprint that involves a company that had not yet been born. I am simply asking the agent to clarify how he managed to trace money moving through a ghost." "Overruled," Judge Jenkins said sharply, leaning forward, suddenly very interested. "Answer the question, Agent Kessler." Kessler swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming on his temple. It is possible there is a discrepancy in the incorporation dates. However, the financial routing codes, Vivian interrupted seamlessly, pulling another document from her binder, were authenticated by an IP address based in Geneva. "I have the login logs right here. Defense Exhibit 407. Can you tell the court where Mr. Roth was on the exact dates those transfers were initiated?" Kessler looked trapped. He glanced at Davies, who was furiously flipping through his own files, panicking. I do not have Mr. Roth's travel itinerary." "I do," Vivian said. She walked over and slammed a stamped, notarized document onto the ledge of the witness box. "He was in federal custody at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan on a completely unrelated, dismissed charge. His phone was confiscated, and he was held in solitary confinement for 30 days. Unless my client has telepathic abilities to authorize Swiss banking transfers from a maximum security federal lockdown, your entire timeline is a fabrication." Chaos erupted in the courtroom. Reporters in the back row began whispering frantically, typing on their phones. Davies was pale, staring at the documents in horror. Judge Jenkins was banging his gavel, shouting for order. Through the noise, Vivian stood perfectly still, her heart racing, adrenaline flooding her veins. She had done it. She had found the invisible thread in the government's web and pulled it until the whole thing unraveled. She turned her head and looked back at the defense table. Antonio Roth was sitting exactly as she had left him. But his expression had changed. The cold, impassive mask was gone. He was looking at Vivian with a dark, burning intensity, a look of absolute possession, respect, and something far more dangerous. He smiled, a slow, predatory curve of his lips that made Vivian's breath catch in her throat. The intern had just drawn first blood, and the Mafia boss had just found his queen. Gavel strikes hammered through the chaotic noise of courtroom 14B, sounding more like gunshots than calls for order. Judge Arthur Jenkins's face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. He pointed a trembling finger at the prosecution table. "Counselors, approach the bench." "Right now," Jenkins commanded, his voice deadly quiet. Vivian Clark's legs felt like they were made of lead as she stood. The adrenaline rush that had carried her through the cross-examination was evaporating, leaving behind a cold, sharp dread. She walked toward the judge's bench, feeling the heavy, murderous glare of Assistant U.S. Attorney Philip Davies burning into the side of her head. "Mr. Davies," Jenkins hissed, keeping his voice low enough that the gallery couldn't hear, though the court reporter's fingers flew across her stenograph machine. "Would you care to explain how the government's star financial expert just authenticated a timeline that is physically, temporally, and legally impossible?" Davies gripped the wooden edge of the bench, his knuckles white. "Your Honor, this is a minor administrative discrepancy. The defense is blowing smoke to distract from the broader pattern of racketeering." "A minor discrepancy?" Vivian fired back, her voice instinctively dropping to a harsh whisper to match the judge's tone. "You placed my client at the center of an international wire fraud conspiracy on dates he was locked inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center. That is not smoke, Mr. Davies. That is perjury, and it suggests the government intentionally withheld exculpatory evidence regarding my client's whereabouts." Jenkins turned his furious gaze on the prosecutor. "If I find out your office buried exculpatory evidence, Philip, I will not only dismiss this forfeiture motion with prejudice, I will personally refer you to the SDNY Ethics Committee. We are taking a 1-hour recess. Fix this mess, or pack your briefcases." The judge spun around and vanished into his chambers. Vivian turned to walk back to the defense table, but before she could take 3 steps, Davies stepped directly into her path. He was a tall man, impeccably groomed, but right now, his veneer of Ivy League superiority had cracked. "You think you're smart, don't you, Miss Clark?" Davies sneered, leaning in so close she could smell the stale peppermint on his breath. "You think you can waltz in here on a student practice permit and embarrass the Department of Justice? I know Raina Hanover ran out on you. I know you're flying blind. Enjoy your little victory, because when this recess is over, I am going to bury you. And when I'm done with your client, I'm going to make sure you never pass the character and fitness evaluation for the New York bar." Vivian's breath hitched. A threat to her bar admission was a threat to her entire life's work. She opened her mouth to respond, but a sudden, terrifying shadow fell over them both. "Is there a problem here, Philip?" The voice was soft, silken, and carried the lethal weight of a loaded firearm. Antonio Roth stepped smoothly between Vivian and the prosecutor. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't make a sudden movement, but the sheer, suffocating menace radiating from him forced Davies to take an involuntary step backward. "Mr. Roth," Davies recovered, forcing a tight, arrogant smile. "I was just congratulating your intern on her beginner's luck. She's going to need a lot more of it." Antonio tilted his head slightly, his glacial eyes locking onto Davies. "My attorney's name is Miss Clark, and if you ever step within 3 feet of her again, or if you ever threaten her career outside the presence of a judge, you will find out exactly why the Justice Department has spent 5 years trying to put me in a cage. Do we understand each other?" Davies swallowed visibly, the color draining from his face. He adjusted his tie, shot Vivian a venomous look, and retreated toward his co-counsel. Antonio turned to Vivian. The cold, sociopathic edge vanished instantly, replaced by a warm, grounding presence. He reached out, his large hand gently cupping her elbow. The touch sent a cascade of heat straight to her chest. "Breathe, Vivian," he murmured. "You're shaking." "He threatened my bar admission," she whispered, the reality of what she was risking crashing down on her. "If I mess this up, I don't just lose your money, I lose my entire future." "You aren't going to lose," Antonio said, guiding her smoothly out of the courtroom and down the marble corridor toward a private defense holding room. "And neither am I." Once the heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, sealing them off from the press and the federal agents, Antonio dropped his guard. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, walked over to a small mahogany table, and poured a glass of water from a plastic pitcher. He handed it to her. "Drink," he ordered softly. Vivian took it with trembling hands, downing half the glass. The silence in the room was thick, charged with an electricity she couldn't ignore. "You gutted him," Antonio said, leaning against the edge of the table, crossing his long legs at the ankles. A genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I have paid men millions of dollars to do what you just did in 15 minutes. "It was basic timeline verification," Vivian deflected, looking down at her scuffed pumps, hyper-aware of how deeply he was looking at her. "Hanover should have caught it months ago." "Hanover didn't catch it because Hanover didn't want to catch it," Antonio stated, his voice dropping into a colder register. Vivian looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" Antonio sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. 10 minutes before you arrived, my security chief intercepted a wire transfer. Raina Hanover didn't just flee due to gambling debts. Those debts were bought up by a private equity firm in Delaware, a firm quietly backed by friends of Philip Davies. The DOJ squeezed my lawyer, bought his debt, and told him to vanish on the morning of the trial, so I would be forced into a default judgment. Vivian felt the blood drain from her face. That's extortion. That's a massive conspiracy. We need to tell the judge." "And prove it how?" Antonio challenged softly. "With illegally intercepted wire transfers that I obtained through unconstitutional means? Jenkins would throw it out, and Davies would pivot to charging me with cyber espionage. No, we play the board as it lies." He stepped closer to her, closing the distance until only inches separated them. He reached out, his knuckles lightly grazing her cheek. Vivian's heart slammed against her ribs. She was standing in a locked room with New York's most dangerous crime boss, and all she could focus on was the intoxicating scent of his cologne and the rough texture of his thumb against her skin. "They thought I would walk into that courtroom defenseless," Antonio murmured, his eyes dropping to her lips. "They didn't account for you. You are the variable they couldn't predict, Vivian, and that makes you the most dangerous person in this building." A sharp knock on the door shattered the moment. "5 minutes, Mr. Roth," a bailiff's muffled voice called out. Antonio stepped back, his mask of aristocratic indifference falling perfectly back into place. "Ready to finish this, counselor?" Vivian took a deep breath, her fear entirely replaced by a burning, unyielding resolve. "Let's go." The atmosphere inside courtroom 14B had shifted. The cocky, relaxed posture of the prosecution team was gone. In its place was the desperate, cornered energy of a predator that had just been wounded. "Is the government prepared to salvage this hearing?" Judge Jenkins asked, looking supremely irritated as he shuffled his notes. Philip Davies stood, his face a mask of grim determination. "We are, Your Honor. The government calls Nathaniel Hayes to the stand." At the defense table, Vivian felt Antonio go completely rigid beside her. It was the first time all day he had shown a physical reaction to anything. She glanced at him, alarmed. His jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle ticked violently near his ear. "Who is Nathaniel Hayes?" Vivian whispered urgently, scrambling to flip through her master witness index. The name wasn't there. "My former chief financial officer," Antonio replied, his voice barely a breath, vibrating with suppressed fury. "He disappeared 3 months ago. My men have been tearing the eastern seaboard apart looking for him." "He wasn't on the discovery list," Vivian said, panic spiking. "Davies hid him." The courtroom doors opened and U.S. Marshals escorted a nervous, sweating man in his late 50s down the aisle. Nathaniel Hayes looked like a man walking to his own execution. He avoided looking at the defense table, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor as he climbed into the witness box and swore the oath. "Mr. Hayes," Davies began, walking confidently to the podium. "Can you please describe your relationship with the defendant, Antonio Roth?" Hayes gripped the microphone, his knuckles white. "I was the chief financial officer for Roth Holdings for 8 years. I managed the corporate ledgers, tax filings, and international investments." "Did you also manage his illicit assets?" Davies asked bluntly. "Objection! Leading!" Vivian shouted, jumping to her feet. "Sustained," Jenkins said. "Rephrase, Mr. Davies." "Mr. Hayes," Davies pivoted smoothly. "Are you familiar with the $800 million currently frozen in the Swiss accounts?" "Yes," Hayes said, his voice trembling slightly. "I personally facilitated the transfer of those funds over a period of 3 years." Davies walked over to the evidence cart and picked up a black, heavy-duty encrypted hard drive, encased in a clear plastic evidence bag. "Your Honor, the government introduces Exhibit 900, an encrypted digital ledger turned over by this witness." Vivian was immediately on her feet again. "Objection! Your Honor, the defense was never provided a copy of this hard drive in discovery. This is a blatant trial by ambush." Davies smiled a viper's smile. "Your Honor, Mr. Hayes has been in protective custody. He only agreed to testify at midnight last night, and this drive was unencrypted at 4 o'clock this morning. Under the federal rules of evidence, we are permitted to introduce rebuttal evidence if it directly contradicts the defense's theory of the case." Judge Jenkins frowned deeply, looking torn. "It is highly prejudicial, Mr. Davies, but given the severe nature of the allegations, I will allow it. But I am giving the defense extreme leeway on cross-examination. Proceed." Vivian sank back into her chair, a sickening feeling twisting in her stomach. "Mr. Hayes," Davies said, holding up the hard drive. "What is contained on this drive?" "It is the shadow ledger," Hayes confessed, finally casting a terrified glance at Antonio Roth. "It tracks the true origin of the $800 million. It didn't come from maritime shipping or real estate. The money was generated through an illegal offshore sports gambling syndicate and illicit arms sales out of the port of Miami. Mr. Roth personally ordered me to scrub the original Cypriot accounts and launder the cash through high-end art purchases at Sotheby's in London before parking it in Switzerland." The gallery erupted. The press row went wild. Davies raised his voice over the noise. Did Antonio Roth explicitly tell you to hide this money from the federal government? Yes, Hayes said clearly. He told me if the DOJ ever found the money, he would ensure I never saw my family again. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. The government rests its direct, Davies said, turning to Vivian with a triumphant, malicious grin. Vivian stared at the digital printout Davies casually tossed onto her desk. It was a summary of the hard drive's contents, columns of dates, massive dollar amounts, and explicit notes about weapons shipments. It was a smoking gun. It was the bullet that would kill Antonio's empire. Miss Clark, Judge Jenkins called out over the murmuring crowd, are you prepared for cross-examination? Vivian's hands hovered over the pages. She looked at Antonio. His face was unreadable, a fortress of cold stone, but she could see the silent resignation in his eyes. He believed it was over. Hayes had delivered the kill shot, but as Vivian's desperate eyes scanned the top page of the Shadow Ledger printout, something caught her attention. It was a microscopic detail, a tiny string of alphanumeric metadata printed in the footer of the document, a specific software version code, V.14.2. Her mind raced back to her late nights in the law library, digging through the metadata of corporate forensic accounting software. She stood up. Your Honor, the defense requests an immediate recess until tomorrow morning to review this entirely new, unvetted piece of evidence. It is fundamentally impossible for me to cross-examine this witness on a 1,000-page ledger I was handed 30 seconds ago. Davies groaned loudly. Your Honor, the defense is stalling again. Judge Jenkins looked at the clock on the wall. It was 4:45 p.m. Mr. Davies, you dropped a bombshell on this court at the 11th hour. The defense is entitled to review the weapon you just used to shoot them, Jenkins ruled firmly. Court is in recess until 9 a.m. tomorrow. Ms. Clark, you have exactly 16 hours. Be ready. The gavel slammed down, echoing with terrifying finality. Vivian collapsed back into her chair. 16 hours. She had 16 hours to dismantle a federal informant, prove the government smoking gun was a fake, and save an empire. Antonio leaned over, his voice a low, gravelly whisper against her ear. Whatever you need tonight, Vivian. My money, my men, my resources. Name it. We are going to war. Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of a Tribeca penthouse. Inside, the massive living space had been transformed into a corporate war room. 6 heavily armed guards stood watch at the private elevator banks, while a team of brilliant, highly compensated underground forensic analysts worked at glowing monitors. Vivian sat at the head of a 12-foot mahogany dining table, completely buried under towering stacks of financial printouts. She had kicked off her heels hours ago. Her blazer hung over the back of her chair, and her hair was tied up in a messy knot. She was running purely on espresso and adrenaline. Antonio watched her from the shadows of the living room, a tumbler of expensive scotch in his hand. He had stripped off his tie and unbuttoned his collar, looking less like a polished venture capitalist, and more like the lethal syndicate boss the government feared. He had spent his entire life surrounded by ruthless men and calculating women, but he had never seen anyone fight quite like Vivian Clark. She was ferocious, relentless, and completely immune to the terror that normally paralyzed civilians in his presence. He walked over and set a fresh cup of coffee next to her keyboard. You have been staring at that same page for 40 minutes. Your eyes are failing. My eyes are perfectly fine, Vivian muttered, not looking up, tracing a manicured fingernail along a string of tiny alphanumeric codes at the bottom of the ledger. I need Declan, Antonio gestured, and a lanky, pale man in a hoodie instantly detached himself from the bank of monitors and jogged over. Declan was Antonio's chief cybersecurity architect, a man who could supposedly crack the Pentagon before breakfast. What do you need, counsellor? Declan asked, leaning over the table. Vivian tapped the printout furiously. Look at this footer metadata. Davies handed this to the judge as an original, contemporaneous shadow ledger from 3 years ago. But look at the software version code embedded in the printing format. It says Sentinel Ledger 5.14.2. Declan squinted at the page. Yeah, I see it. What about it? Sentinel Ledger is the primary accounting software used by Fortune 500 companies, Vivian explained, her heart pounding as the puzzle pieces slammed into place. I wrote a paper on corporate compliance software last semester. Version 14.2 wasn't released 3 years ago. It was rolled out globally exactly 8 months ago, meaning these documents couldn't have been generated concurrently with the transfers. Antonio set his drink down, the clink of crystal against wood sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. Are you telling me the government fabricated the evidence? Not the government, Vivian said, shaking her head, her eyes wide with terrifying clarity. Davies is too careful to risk a manufactured evidence charge. He wouldn't forge a document and hand it to a federal judge. He got this from Nathaniel Hayes. But Hayes has been in protective custody, completely cut off from the outside world. He didn't have a laptop or access to corporate software. Then who made the ledger? Antonio asked, his voice dropping an octave, radiating cold fury. Whoever bought Raina Hanover, Vivian breathed out. Whoever paid off your lawyer to abandon you also manufactured this fake ledger and fed it to Hayes to present in court. They knew Davies would be desperate enough to use it without verifying the software metadata. We just have to prove where it came from. Declan, Antonio ordered, his tone deadly. Hack into Sentinel's corporate registry. Trace every single purchase of version 14.2 in the tri-state area over the last 8 months. Look for shell companies, offshore routing numbers, anything tied to Raina Hanover's gambling debts. I'm on it, boss, Declan said, practically sprinting back to his terminal. Silence descended over the table again. Vivian slumped back in her chair, pressing the heels of her hands into her tired eyes. A sudden wave of exhaustion crashed over her, threatening to pull her under. Antonio stepped behind her chair. Gently, he pulled her hands away from her face. His long fingers began to massage the tight, knotted muscles at the base of her neck. Vivian gasped softly at the contact, instantly melting into his touch. It was profoundly intimate, entirely inappropriate for an intern and a client, but she didn't care. He was anchoring her to the earth. You are incredible, do you know that? Antonio murmured, his voice a dark, rough caress against her ear. They sent an army of federal prosecutors, and you dismantled them with a software update. We haven't won yet, Vivian whispered, closing her eyes as his thumbs worked, a particularly deep knot in her shoulder. We still have to prove it in court. If Jenkins doesn't buy the metadata argument, he'll rule for forfeiture. You'll lose the $800 million. Antonio stopped massaging her shoulders. He leaned down, bracing his hands on the armrests of her chair, trapping her gently in place. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the crown of her head. I don't care about the money, Antonio said softly. Vivian opened her eyes, twisting in her chair to look up at him. What are you talking about? It's your entire empire. Empires can be rebuilt, Antonio replied, looking down into her wide, exhausted eyes. The absolute sincerity in his gaze took her breath away. I care about the loyalty of the people standing beside me when the walls come crashing down. Raina took my money and ran. You stayed, Vivian. You stood up in front of a federal judge and put your entire future on the line for a man you barely know. That is worth infinitely more than $800 million. Before Vivian could process the sheer weight of his words, Declan shouted from across the room, "Got it! I bypassed the firewall!" Antonio straightened up instantly, the soft, vulnerable man vanishing, replaced once again by the ruthless kingpin. "What did you find?" "You're going to want to see this, boss," Declan said, turning his monitor towards them. "You too, counselor. You just caught the biggest rat in New York." Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Vivian and Antonio crowded behind Declan's workstation. The hacker's screen was filled with cascading lines of code, resolving into a digital invoice from Sentinel Software Incorporated. Version 14.2 was purchased exactly 4 weeks ago, Declan explained, pointing a pen at the screen. It was licensed to a Delaware LLC called Apex Consulting. I ran a dark web trace on Apex's routing numbers. It's a ghost company. But the initial seed money to open the corporate bank account came from a private equity firm. The same private equity firm that bought Rainer Hanover's gambling debts, Antonio deduced, his eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "Exactly," Declan nodded. "But it gets worse. I dug into the IP address that actually generated the fabricated shadow ledger. The document wasn't created in New York. It was generated on a secure server located in the Cayman Islands. Vivian's mind spun like a roulette wheel, landing firmly on the winning number. Nathaniel Hayes was the CFO. He knew the Cayman Islands banking architecture better than anyone. Hanover didn't just abandon the case. He teamed up with Hayes. Hanover manufactured the fake ledger, and Hayes agreed to present it to the DOJ to secure himself immunity, while simultaneously ensuring Antonio took the fall. "Why?" Antonio asked quietly. Hayes was terrified of me. Why would he risk crossing me? "Because Hanover paid him," Vivian said, pointing to a secondary wire transfer on the screen. "Look right there." 4 days before Hayes turned himself in to the federal prosecutors, Apex Consulting wired $5 million into a hidden trust in Hayes' daughter's name. It was a payoff. Hanover and Hayes conspired to frame you using a forged ledger, so Hanover could clear his debts and Hayes could retire as a millionaire with federal protection. Antonio stared at the screen, a chilling, absolute silence radiating from him. When he finally spoke, it sounded like a death sentence. "Print the routing numbers. Print the software licenses. Print the Cayman server logs. Every single page." "Legally, I can't use hacked documents," Vivian panicked, grabbing Antonio's arm. "If I introduce illegally obtained dark web wire transfers in federal court, Judge Jenkins will hold me in contempt and throw out the evidence. It has to be admissible." Antonio looked down at her hand, gripping his forearm. He covered her hand with his own, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "Do you trust me, Vivian?" he asked softly. "Yes," she answered immediately, surprising herself with the absolute truth of it. "Then let me handle the admissibility," Antonio promised. He pulled out his encrypted cell phone and dialed a number. "Cole, it's Roth. I need a certified private investigator to legally subpoena a Delaware LLC named Apex Consulting, and I need it fast-tracked through the night court docket by 6 a.m. Call Judge Masterson. Tell him he owes me a favor for the zoning permits last year." Antonio hung up and turned back to Vivian. "By the time court convenes, you will have a perfectly legal, court-ordered subpoena authorizing the financial records Declan just found. No hacking charges, no contempt." Vivian let out a shuddering breath, a fierce, triumphant smile breaking across her face. "Then Nathaniel Hayes is dead on the stand." "Go sleep," Antonio commanded softly, leading her away from the monitors toward the plush velvet sofa in the center of the living room. "You have 4 hours before we leave for the courthouse. You need rest." "I can't sleep," Vivian protested, though her eyelids felt like sandpaper. "I need to draft the cross-examination outline." I need to figure out exactly how to trap him." Antonio didn't listen. He gently pushed her down onto the sofa. He took off his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders, the silk lining carrying his intoxicating scent, cedar and danger. "You don't need an outline," Antonio said, crouching in front of her so they were at eye level. He brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his touch agonizingly tender. "You already know how to trap him. You are brilliant. Just close your eyes, Vivian." She was too exhausted to fight him. She curled her legs up underneath her, pulling his heavy jacket tight around her chest. "Wake me up at 7, she mumbled, her eyes drifting shut. "I will," Antonio promised. He didn't move. He stayed crouched by the sofa for hours, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest as the city skyline outside the windows slowly turned from pitch black to a bruised, magnificent purple. For the first time in 10 years, Antonio Roth wasn't thinking about his enemies, his offshore accounts, or the federal agents trying to cage him. He was thinking about the 24-year-old intern who had stepped in front of a firing squad to protect his empire. When the sun finally crested over the East River, flooding the penthouse in brilliant gold light, Antonio stood up. He adjusted his cuffs, walked to the glass table, and stacked the freshly printed, legally certified subpoenas into a neat pile. The defense was ready. 2 hours later, Vivian Clark walked through the heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 14B. She wore a tailored black skirt suit that Antonio's assistant had procured that morning, her hair pulled back into a severe, professional twist. She carried a single manila folder, completely unbothered by the frantic whispering of the reporters in the gallery. Antonio walked beside her, radiating supreme confidence. At the prosecution table, Philip Davies looked up. He expected to see a broken, panicked law student preparing to surrender. Instead, he saw a woman walking to the defense table like an executioner, approaching the block. Judge Jenkins took the bench and slammed his gavel. "Court is now in session," Jenkins boomed. "Mr. Hayes, you remain under oath. Ms. Clark, the defense may proceed with its cross-examination." Vivian stood up. She didn't walk to the podium. She walked straight to the center of the room, stopping directly in front of Nathaniel Hayes. "Mr. Hayes," Vivian said, her voice echoing perfectly in the silent room. "Let's talk about $5 million. Vivian Clark did not wait for the witness to catch his breath. She stood perfectly planted in the center of the courtroom, an absolute vision of lethal composure, holding a single, legally subpoenaed manila folder. "Let's talk about $5 million, Mr. Hayes," Vivian repeated, her voice cutting through the heavy silence like a serrated blade. "It is a substantial retirement fund, isn't it?" Philip Davies shot up from the prosecution table, his chair scraping violently. "Objection! Your Honor, relevance. There has been absolutely no mention of $5 million in this forfeiture proceeding." "I am establishing the witness's motive to commit perjury, Your Honor," Vivian replied coolly, not even bothering to look at the prosecutor. "I assure the court, the relevance will become devastatingly clear in about 60 seconds. Judge Jenkins leaned forward, his eyes darting between the young intern and the sweating, pale witness. "Overruled. You may proceed, Miss Clark." "Tread carefully." "Thank you," Vivian said. She turned her piercing gaze back to Nathaniel Hayes. "Mr. Hayes, you testified yesterday that you personally generated this digital shadow ledger, Government Exhibit 900, over 3 years ago, concurrently with the wire transfers to Switzerland. Is that your sworn testimony?" Hayes swallowed audibly. He looked at Davies, but the prosecutor offered no help. "Yes, that is my testimony. And you used standard corporate accounting software to maintain these illicit records?" "Yes," Hayes croaked out. "Sentinel Ledger." Vivian nodded slowly, acting as if she were simply confirming a mundane fact. Sentinel Ledger, a highly reputable program utilized by financial institutions worldwide, including BlackRock and JP Morgan Chase. Very standard. Tell me, Mr. Hayes, are you a time traveler? Davies slammed his hand on the table. Objection. Badgering. Sustained, Jenkins snapped. Miss Clark, drop the theatrics. My apologies, Your Honor, Vivian said smoothly. She pulled a piece of paper from her folder and placed it on the projector screen for the entire courtroom to see. Mr. Hayes, this is the final page of the shadow ledger you provided to the Department of Justice. Could you read the alphanumeric metadata printed in the bottom right corner? Hayes squinted at the screen. A visible tremor started in his hands. It says, V.14.2. Version 14.2, Vivian echoed loudly. Your Honor, the defense submits into evidence Exhibit 410, an authenticated corporate release schedule from Sentinel Software Incorporated. Version 14.2 was released to the public exactly 8 months ago. Yet Mr. Hayes claims he used it to generate a document 3 years ago. A collective, deafening gasp rippled through the gallery. The press rows scrambled, reporters practically climbing over each other to furiously type the breaking development on their laptops. Philip Davies lost all the color in his face. He stared at the projected metadata, his mouth slightly open, the devastating reality of his catastrophic failure sinking in. He had staked his entire career on a forged document. Mr. Hayes, Vivian pressed, stepping closer to the witness box, her presence suddenly towering and authoritative. How did you use software that did not exist to frame my client? Hayes stammered, his eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for an exit that wasn't there. It must have been a system update. The files auto-updated when I opened them. A creative lie, but a lie nonetheless, Vivian fired back, pulling out the overnight subpoenas Antonio's fixer had secured. Because we subpoenaed the software license, Defense Exhibit 411, version 14. 2 was purchased exactly 4 weeks ago by a Delaware shell company named Apex Consulting. The exact same shell company that mysteriously paid off the millions of dollars in gambling debts owed by Antonio Roth's former lead counsel, Raina Hanover. The courtroom erupted into total chaos. Judge Jenkins banged his gavel relentlessly, shouting for order, but the noise barely dipped. Antonio Roth sat at the defense table, his eyes locked onto Vivian, a dark, immensely proud smile playing on his lips. She was destroying them, systematically, mercilessly, and brilliantly. Order! Order in my courtroom! Jenkins roared, his face purple with rage. The gallery finally quieted down, though the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Jenkins turned a murderous glare on the prosecution. Mr. Davies, if your witness does not explain this discrepancy immediately, I will have U.S. Marshals take him into custody for perjury. He doesn't need to explain the software, Your Honor, Vivian interrupted, delivering the final, fatal blow. She slapped the last document onto the ledge of the witness box. Because he needs to explain this. Defense Exhibit 412, a certified offshore banking record from Credit Suisse. 4 days before, Mr. Hayes surrendered to the Justice Department with this forged ledger. Apex Consulting wired exactly $5 million into a blind trust. The beneficiary of that trust is Clara Hayes, your 22-year-old daughter. Hayes broke. A sob tore from his throat, and he buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently. Raina Hanover set it up. Hayes wept, his voice echoing through the stunned courtroom. Hanover knew the DOJ was going to indict him for his gambling money laundering. He came to me. He said we could both get out. He bought the software through a shell company, typed up the fake ledger, and paid me the $5 million to hand it to Davies and point the finger at Mr. Roth. I'm sorry. I just wanted to protect my family." "You protected no one," Vivian said softly, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. She turned her back on the broken man and looked directly at Judge Jenkins. "Your Honor," Vivian stated, her voice echoing with unwavering authority, "the government has built a forfeiture case on perjured testimony, fabricated evidence, and a criminal conspiracy orchestrated by a compromised attorney. The defense moves for an immediate dismissal with prejudice and the full, unconditional release of the $800 million belonging to Antonio Roth." Judge Arthur Jenkins sat in absolute silence for 10 agonizing seconds. He looked at the weeping informant, the shattered federal prosecutor, and finally, the 24-year-old intern who had just humiliated the entire United States Department of Justice. "Mr. Davies," Jenkins said, his voice trembling with a quiet, volcanic fury, "I am referring this entire prosecution team to the Attorney General's Office of Professional Responsibility. Furthermore, I am issuing an immediate bench warrant for the arrest of Raina Hanover on charges of extortion, manufacturing evidence, and conspiracy to commit perjury." Davies slowly sat down in his chair, putting his head in his hands. He was ruined. Jenkins turned to the defense table, his expression softening just a fraction as he looked at Vivian. "Ms. Clark, in my 30 years on the federal bench, I have never witnessed a more spectacular dismemberment of a corrupt prosecution. You have done your client, and the law, an extraordinary service today." Jenkins raised his wooden gavel. "The government's motion for civil asset forfeiture is denied. This case is dismissed with prejudice. The freeze on Mr. Roth's assets is lifted immediately. We are adjourned." The gavel slammed down, and the courtroom exploded. Reporters shouted. Marshals moved in to arrest Nathaniel Hayes right out of the witness box, and the gallery dissolved into a frantic frenzy of movement. Through it all, Vivian stood frozen by the podium. She couldn't breathe. Her knees suddenly felt like water. The crushing weight of the last 48 hours vanished, leaving her entirely lightheaded. She had won. She had actually won. Before she could collapse, strong, warm hands gripped her waist. Antonio turned her around, pulling her flush against his chest. The courtroom chaos melted away, reduced to nothing more than background noise. All Vivian could see were his striking, tempestuous grey eyes, filled with a burning, possessive heat that made her heart slam against her ribs. "You did it," Antonio murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "We did it," Vivian corrected breathlessly, looking up at him. "Your money is safe." "Fuck the money," Antonio said softly. He didn't care about the cameras, the reporters, or the feds watching them. He brought his hand up, his thumb tracing the soft curve of her lower lip. "Let's go home." 10 minutes later, surrounded by a wall of private security contractors, pushing through the mob of screaming journalists on the courthouse steps, Vivian and Antonio slipped into the cavernous, tinted back seat of a waiting Maybach. The heavy armored doors slammed shut, cutting off the noise of the flashing cameras and the rain. The car glided smoothly away from Foley Square, the silence inside the cabin thick and electrically charged. Vivian leaned her head back against the plush leather headrest, closing her eyes, a tired smile touching her lips. "I need to go back to the firm and pack up my cubicle. If Hanover is being arrested, the partners are going to dissolve the firm by Friday. I'm going to need a new internship to finish my graduation requirements." "You aren't going back to that firm," Antonio stated, pouring 2 glasses of celebratory champagne from the car's crystal decanter. He handed her one. Vivian opened her eyes, taking the glass. "Antonio, I have to. I'm still a student." "You're a partner," Antonio corrected smoothly, his eyes flashing with brilliant, calculating fire. I bought a commercial high-rise in Midtown this morning while you were sleeping. It is currently being gutted and renovated to serve as the headquarters for the law firm of Clark and Associates. You are the senior managing partner. Vivian nearly dropped her champagne. What? Antonio, I haven't even taken the bar exam yet. You will pass it on the first try. Until then, you will hire the best legal minds in the city to work under your direct supervision, Antonio replied, leaning closer to her, the sheer gravity of his presence pulling her in. I am pulling all of my legal retainers from every firm in the country. Roth Holdings is now your exclusive client. You will handle all of my legitimate business, and you will protect me from the illegitimate. I trust no one else, Vivian. Only you. He was offering her an empire of her own, millions of dollars in retainer fees, infinite power, and a permanent place by the side of the most dangerous, captivating man she had ever met. You're insane, Vivian whispered, her heart racing not with fear, but with a sudden, wild exhilaration. I am a man who knows a priceless asset when he sees one, Antonio countered, his gaze dropping to her lips. He gently took the champagne glass from her hand and set it aside. You saved my life today, counselor. Now, how much is your retainer? It's going to be astronomically high, Vivian breathed out, her hands instinctively moving to rest flat against his chest, feeling the heavy, steady beating of his heart beneath his silk tie. I have $800 million, Antonio murmured, his face inches from hers. Drain me dry. He didn't wait for her response. Antonio closed the distance, capturing her lips in a fierce, deeply consuming kiss. It wasn't tentative, it was a claim. It was raw, powerful, and laced with the adrenaline of survival and absolute victory. Vivian gasped against his mouth, her fingers tangling in the dark hair at the nape of his neck as she kissed him back with equal, reckless ferocity. The rain continued to beat against the tinted windows of the Maybach as it disappeared into the Manhattan traffic, carrying the untouchable syndicate king and the brilliant young queen who had just conquered his world. The gavel has fallen, but the real reign of Vivian and Antonio has just begun. From an overworked intern to the undisputed legal queen of a mafia empire, Vivian proved that the most dangerous weapon in a courtroom is a brilliant mind. Will her new firm survive the dark underworld of the Roth Syndicate? Or will their explosive romance burn it all to the ground? If you want to see more thrilling mafia legal dramas, smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below with your favorite plot twist.